Hi guys, welcome to another video in which Lewis Too Much studies the Bible. We're going to be looking at another controversial teaching from Jesus. Now, this teaching, I don't know that it's going to be controversial on the surface. So I think when you read it, your brain actually kind of agrees with it. I don't think that there's that much controversy in terms of people disagreeing with this as a general rule for life. But I think that in practice, it's controversial in the sense that I think a lot of us agree with it with our heads, but then disagree with it with our actions. And I think that this applies to both people outside of Christianity and people within Christianity. And so let's go ahead and get right into it. Getting my Bible here. And so the teaching is found in Matthew chapter 6. It's still part of the Sermon on the Mount. And so Matthew chapter 6, it starts off by saying, "Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Thus, when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you." Now, because I like to address these videos to not only Christians, but to people that are outside the church, I want to start off by pointing out that Jesus does make an assumption with this teaching here. And what he assumes right off the bat is that there's a God who is overseeing all of our actions and is actually capable of, if you do something in secret, seeing that thing that you did in secret and actually rewarding you in some sort of way for that act that you did in secret. And so, we have to state right off the bat that, that you have to kind of assume God in order for that part of the teaching to come to fruition. But I still think that this teaching, regardless of whether or not you believe that there is a God or not, still is actually a very good moral teaching. And I'm going to explain why. So on the front end, I'm kind of going to go through a few questions that we might ask of this passage. And so the first and most obvious one is, if you do something that's good, why shouldn't you get credit for doing that thing that's good? Why shouldn't you get the social reward of doing that thing that's good? You see all kinds of rich celebrity types that give a ton of money to charity, and then they put out press releases and all that kind of stuff. Or a businessman might do the same thing. Why not? In fact, we're seeing that all the time from corporations nowadays, right? Where they'll support some righteous cause, some cause that society right now thinks is worthy of applauding, and they'll actually put it in their commercials and everything like that. And so they're actually trying to attract business by being socially conscious, or by doing socially good things. So why not? Why is that not okay? Why is that not appropriate according to Jesus? Why is this something that we should avoid doing? Now, so let's first of all get the idea of reward out of the equation, because the idea that God rewards people is actually kind of a tricky thing that we'd have to deal with, because from a biblical perspective, we're not always rewarded in this life. And so if you're doing something good for the sake of getting rewarded in this life, that's not biblically, that's not something that you should actually be concerned with, because ultimately you might not get that reward in this life. And so when it says that God rewards those who do something in secret, biblically what that's talking about is actually the reward is, some Christians think that there's rewards in the next life. Whether that's the case or not, depending on good deeds, whether that's the case or not, I'm not really interested in that. To me, if I make it to the next life, into eternal life, I'm going to be happy with that. So I don't, any additional rewards or bonus at that point. And so I kind of want to be more concerned with this life. So if the idea is that, you know, God rewards in some special secret way, you know, what is that reward that he's giving us? And so in Christianity, that reward is actually himself. And what that means is that he's actually, when a human interacts with God within Christianity, what that means is that God is actually bringing you much more into the light, in the sense that God is making you more into the sort of person that he wants you to be. And so in a sense, that's actually the reward in and of itself. And so if you're concerned with becoming a more and more morally righteous person, or a more and more effective person in the world in terms of doing good, this teaching, like I said before, I think still applies to you, whether or not you believe in God, because ultimately, I think that the point here in terms of asking the question, why shouldn't I get the reward? The reason is because if you start doing good things for the social reward, it will turn you into the sort of person that's constantly looking to the approval of others in order to act in the world. And sometimes the approval of others might be good, because sometimes the crowd is right. Sometimes the crowd is telling you to do a good thing, and hey, if that's the case, that's great. But the crowd is not always right, and that's where you run into a problem, which is when you start doing good deeds in order to be recognized by the crowd. What if the crowd suddenly starts turning and doing things that are wrong, or valuing things that are wrong, and then your willingness to do good deeds is dependent on their approval? Now all of a sudden you're in the position that you're not going to be able to do the right thing anymore, because you're dependent on the crowd's approval. And so when you do good, you shouldn't be actually concerned with what the crowd desires. You should be concerned with doing what's good, regardless of whether or not the crowd is going to applaud you or not. And again, that dopamine kick from doing something good, which is kind of what Jesus is talking about there, where he says, you've received your reward from that praise from the crowd. You don't, if your concern is actually to become a more and more righteous person, the sort of person that can do righteous acts in the world, you don't want to get addicted to that dopamine kick, because that dopamine kick is actually going to become a drug for you, and is going to make you less capable of being that sort of righteous person that can do righteous things in the world, because you're so dependent on that dopamine kick that that you essentially become kind of like an addict to that dopamine kick. And so that's the first question that I would address is, why not get rewarded for my good deeds? The second question I would ask is, how are we supposed to bring awareness to good causes if we're not advertising that we're doing these good causes? Now, I think that this is kind of a tricky one, because I do think there's a place for advertising, like if let's say that you start a charity, right? Advertising that charity so that people can be aware of it. So, there's to some degree there's some validity to that, obviously. And so I think that you have to be wise about that, and you have to essentially analyze yourself. Like, am I doing this so that a lot of people can know that I'm a good person, or am I doing this because, I need to attract a bunch of people to my cause? Because ultimately, I mean, Jesus went around, collecting people to his cause. So there obviously has to be some degree of being able to do that. Now, one thing that I think that is overlooked is what degree good deeds actually ripple out into the world. And there was this movie called Pay It Forward that I really love that movie. And it's all about the idea that, like, if one person does one good deed, that one, and kind of tells that other person to pay forward the good deed, and then that person is so grateful to the last person that they will then do another good deed. And eventually, if everybody starts paying forward good deeds, then these good deeds kind of ripple outward, and there's this sort of organic effect to the good deeds. And so in terms of advertising, when you want to, like, collect a bunch of people all at once. Obviously, that can be effective, but I think that we underestimate sometimes how effective, just going out and doing the good deed is, and then letting the good deed kind of speak for itself, and allowing for other people who are also interested in doing good get attracted to that good deed through the spread of, basically through the spread of kind of the organic spread, the word of mouth spread of that good deed. That actually might be a much more effective tool in attracting the sort of people that you want to participate with you in your charity, in your charitable act, or in your cause, or whatever the case may be, right? Because a lot of times what happens, right, when you advertise is you're not actually vetting who's coming into your cause. And a lot of the people that are coming into your cause might not actually be pure believers, you know what I mean? And because, there's no vetting, versus if you just start doing your good deed, the sort of people that are attracted to that good deed are going to automatically be, they won't automatically because they have to find out about it, but, eventually the sorts of people that are attracted to those sorts of good deeds are going to hear that you did that and then want to join in with you. And then there's kind of like a natural vetting process of the sorts of people that are going to come into your cause with you. And so in that sense, I actually think that it's a good practice also to not basically publicly advertise your good deeds. Let the good deeds speak for itself and let it ripple outward into the world. Now, the last question that I wanted to address, because this was actually posed to me one time, and I think it's a good question, and it left me thinking for a while, and I kind of eventually arrived at an answer, and so that's what I want to talk about for the next couple minutes here. Is who cares what sort of a person does good deeds, as long as good deeds get done? And so the person who asked me this, used the example, like, let's say that there's a bunch of homeless people that need to be fed, right? But there's a bunch of jerks that are like completely consumed with narcissistic ego, and it just makes them feel good to go out and give food, and then afterward they all congratulate each other and pat each other on the back and all of that kind of stuff. Ultimately, who cares? Because the people that needed food got food, so now they're fed. And so what's the big deal if there's a bunch of narcissists that do good deeds? Like, why does it matter that the person who does a good deed also be a good person, or does the good deed for a good reason? And I think it's this. First of all, I have to acknowledge on the front end, it's good that the homeless person got food, right? That's good. Now, what happened to the person who gave the food? They became, in this person's illustration, they became a little bit more narcissistic because they congratulated themselves on feeding the homeless. And so let's say that they keep doing this, right? More and more, they're going to become the sort of person that I described when I was answering the first question, somebody who's completely addicted to basically the social environment congratulating them on being a good person. And then this person more and more becomes the sort of person that actually is incapable of doing good deeds. And so the way that this person interacts with the other people in their life is typically not going to be very positive. And so this person essentially over time is more than likely going to stop doing those good deeds. And even if they do keep doing good deeds forever, this is actually the larger point. What if that person actually was concerned with humbling themselves and kind of taking themselves, the congratulations out of their deed? If they were that sort of person, how much more good could they do in the world if they were that sort of a person? And see, I think that that's ultimately what Jesus is trying to get at here, is like, look, sure, like the people that were living in this time that Jesus is critiquing, that would get bells rung, whenever they would do good deeds or give a bunch of money or whatever, like, yeah, that money was given. But ultimately, those sorts of people were creating a society in which essentially narcissism was the reason to do good deeds. And unfortunately, if you have an entire society of narcissists who only do good deeds for their own congratulations, what you end up with is a society full of narcissists, and a society full of narcissists is not a very good society, because everybody's ultimately just looking out for themselves, and what that does is actually create more problems in the long run. Even though it's solving problems in the short term, it's creating problems in the long term. And so I think that that's why it actually does matter whether or not the person who does a good deed is doing a good deed for the right reason. Because if you do a good deed for the right reason, you become the sort of person that can create a better environment for the people that are around you, versus if you're the sort of person that's doing it for your own self-congratulations, you're actually creating a worse environment for the people around you. And if you create a worse environment for the people around you, then those people are miserable, and then they create a worse environment for the people around them. And that actually creates larger problems than the problem that you fixed by, going out into the world and doing some, one good deed for a narcissistic reason. Because maybe if we had a society full of people that were generous and loved human beings and did good things out of the goodness of their hearts, versus for narcissistic approval from from the rest of the society, maybe we wouldn't need to have that one moment where we're feeding the homeless people, because maybe the homeless people would always be fed, because there's so many good people from that ripple effect of goodness, that the homeless people always have food no matter where they go. And I actually think that you kind of see that in the sense that, forever churches have been setting up these charitable foundations like the Salvation Army and that kind of thing, where homeless people can go and be fed in these large-scale situations, because 200 years ago some selfless person wanted very much to do good in the world and not be concerned with themselves. And so now you have a situation where, in most cities, you'll have a Salvation Army that does feed the homeless. And so typically, homeless, I've lived in cities where homeless people have actually told me straight up, if you starve in this city, it's your own fault, because there's so many, Christian charities all around the place that give out free food that there's no reason for you to ever be hungry. And so I think that that's the sort of thing that Jesus was after, was this, to create a community of people that were so willing to give of themselves, that they would actually solve nip the problem in the bud, rather than, just put little band-aids on the problem. Now, in closing, like I always do, I always issue a challenge to Christians when I do these videos. And so my challenge is basically, the way that I did the rest of the video was by asking questions. And so I'm going to close by asking a question, which is, how do Christians fall short sometimes of this teaching? And they do. And I've seen it a million times. One big way that I see us fall victim to this is, us taking pictures for our church websites, taking pictures for our Facebook feeds and all of that kind of stuff of us doing good deeds, because ultimately what we're doing is we're trusting advertising versus trusting God. And so, I was addressing this video for the most part to people who are not believers in God, and kind of making a case as to why it's better to do good deeds, not for, social congratulations, but rather, for the sake of doing good. If people that don't believe in God can do that, how much more so should Christians be doing that, who do believe in God, who do believe that there's a God who's powerful enough to actually take that act that you performed and, and stretch it out and spread it like a ripple in a pool. How much more should Christians be trusting that their good deeds actually have impact in the world? Because every time that they do a good deed, they're actually living out God's they're actually manifesting God in that moment. And so every time that God is manifest in a moment, then God obviously gets spread outward into the world. And if we actually believe that God is powerful, then we should definitely believe and trust that we don't need to advertise our good deeds, because the good deeds will speak for themselves, and they'll have power in and of themselves, and they'll create change in the world in and of themselves. And so, as I said, I don't think that the teaching itself is controversial, but I think that applying the teaching is controversial, because I think even Christians, we get caught up thinking the way that the world thinks, and wondering to ourselves and thinking to ourselves that, well, the only way that this works is the way that, the world makes it work. So, and I think that Jesus presumes right off the bat that there's a God that makes the impossible possible. And so I think that as Christians, we should probably be careful about falling into the trap of thinking the way that the world thinks. All right, guys, thank you so much for listening. I love all of you. I really appreciate you all. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I hope to see you next week.